Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Good to have you here for another Learning Lab. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Philipp Goedeking. And he has a very interesting profile, I have to admit. He started off a PhD in biology, spent a lot of time in biology and National Institute of Health in the US before moving on to Lufthansa. And then I imagine he caught the aviation bug because he stayed in aviation related fields, spent some time in different consulting firms, including Boston Global Group and Roland Berger, before founding Air Economy and Avinomics as well, where he is now the founder and managing partner. Philipp will be giving us a presentation on impact, which is obviously very theme and sustainability, which it seems is very, very timely, as you can all agree. So Philipp, the floor is yours too, and then after that, sorry, an important point I always forget to mention this, but at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A button in the Zoom app. So please use it to put in any question that you have. And after Philipp's presentation, I'll be happy to put these questions to him, and we can hopefully have a good discussion to discuss. Thank you, and Philipp, floor is yours.
Share my screen. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Today's presentation is about impact. Impact was founded March last year, rapidly growing. The idea when we founded Impact was that we need standards for sustainable aircraft and aviation finance. There were an increasing number of transactions lacking standards, and a group of banks met and said, we need more standards, real standards for reporting, for covenants, for all kinds of purposes. And there is no way to implement, monitor and align a sustainability strategy if you don't know the numbers. So one of the first elements we decided we have to focus on after founding Impact was metrics. What are the metrics that we need? And I will guide you through the progress and the process, how we developed these metrics, what the status is, and what the next steps are. And the challenge is to be pragmatic to the extent possible, crawl, walk, run, and at the same time be precise and not leaving any loopholes for greenwashing. Impact is an organization, as I said, founded March last year, and it's a non-profit organization registered in Frankfurt, Germany, just because the founding members, most of them were based in Frankfurt, but meanwhile we are very global, rapidly growing globally. And there are some specifics about Impact. We have 6 working streams, and all these working groups or working streams are run by the members themselves. We have the mantra, by the members, for the members. So there are no external consultants active in any of these work streams. The work streams we currently run are lending, how to develop templates for lending contracts. The same for leasing. We need to develop templates for lease contracts, significantly more complex than for lending. We have a newly established science group. We are compiling, and pretty successful, inviting the leading scholars of this world to join this group to make sure we have a very solid footing in this scientific field as well, to make sure what we do, what we think, and in the direction we walk is scientifically solid as possible. We prepare some publications on various issues, scientific publications. So as to make sure, as I said, that this is on solid scientific footing. We have a group working on reporting standards, how to satisfy the reporting requirements, regulated or other sources, to make sure that the airlines all can refer to the same standard when preparing the reports, and that as many banks as possible can rely on a given standard when they get reports from the airline clients. Now, we have a very large group, enablers. This group focuses on understanding the technologies needed to decarbonize this industry, be it SAF, carbon capture, or any other of these techniques relevant to decarbonize. It's not that we invest ourselves or that we recommend particular investments, but we want to understand these enablers. Last but not least, we are setting up a group for fundraising, because the scientific work that we have in mind requires some funding for the people involved. That so much on impact as an organization. I have the pleasure to be part of the board. Within the board, I'm responsible for the metrics. To start, just a brief chart of what the key problem of this industry is about. We are growing faster than we are able to reduce CO2. At whatever airline you look at, just two examples, Lufthansa and EasyJet. If you look at the RPK performance of both airlines, you see they are growing rapidly, which is good news. CO2 is growing as well. The gap is slightly widening, but if you look to the right, over the last, for 2010 to 2019, for that period of time, RPK grew by 6.5, CO2 by 3.5. So if the CO2 footprint is still growing, we are moving away from the Paris Climate Accord objectives. So we need to reduce our CO2 footing, hopefully without any need to degrow. At the same time, and this relates to the degrowth discussion, the GDP is 3.1. So the aviation industry is growing about twice as fast as the GDP, which is very telling about the demand and the volume and the importance of aviation for this world in its entirety. So it's not, for many reasons, a good idea to claim significant degrowth of the aviation industry. That would be probably more harmful than anything else. But the problem that we keep emitting more and more CO2 is a severe problem. We all are used to the KPI intensity. Intensity is very simple. It's the ratio between the CO2 per RPK. Intensity pretends an improvement because the gap is widening. But if the intensity evolution pretends an improvement and CO2 is worsening, we have a problem. Obviously, these two KPIs combined do not tell the full story. And this applies to whatever airline you look at. If you take the International Energy Agency's forecast, and they have forecasted or predicted or proposed how much of today's or 2019's CO2 emissions from aviation have to be eliminated or reduced by 2050 to be compliant with the 1.5 degrees objective, then that would mean that from 2019 onwards, we have to reduce 5% CO2 emissions each year. And each year, we still emit positive emissions, more emissions, the more demanding the objective is what we need to reduce each year. What we need as a metric, and this kept us busy for months last year and well into this year, is to define what is a good KPI, when are metrics good, when are they helpful, and to find the respective metrics that satisfy these criteria. Any metrics must be analytically sound. That means it must measure what it is supposed to. This is easier said than done. I will elaborate in a second the difference between net zero and 1.5 degree warming. Net zero is a very different concept from 1.5 degrees. So we need to decide which way to go. Any model that we need must be transparent and reliable in terms of assumptions. If you look at the various pathways available in the literature from various organizations, be it IEA or others, and they make particular forecasts, what is needed in the future, what will happen, and where to be in the year 25 or 2035 to be above or below the line. To do that, you have to make certain assumptions on how much SAF will be available, by when, in what quality, at what price, and what will be the price elasticity response from the demand side if SAF is more expensive than fossil fuel, and it will be significantly more expensive. So these pathways all depend on assumptions, and they drive the result up and down significantly if you vary the various assumptions. If true, and we also observe that the providers of these pathways update their forecasts each year. You cannot use a reference in a credit contract or lease contract that varies each year, because then you have to go to your contract counterpart and reopen the agreement and rediscuss the basic covenants. And this is a call for conflict. You cannot do that. Also, Occam's razor, you know that concept. A good model is a simple model. Whatever metric you use, it must be relevant for strategy and policy. So it must be credible. It must be simple, easy to interpret and understand. It must be resilient to greenwashing, and it must offer sufficient clarity for decision-making. 100 pages of individual data, even as complete as possible, don't tell the story you need to take a decision. You must translate these plethora of KPIs into guidelines for decision-making, for informed decision-making. Last but not least, measurability. You need to be able to calculate these data, and you need to have access to the data to run, to calculate. Of course, we are all aware, we are all subject of public scrutiny, both the banks and the airlines, and both combined are pretty evil in public perception. We have various regulatory requirements for reporting, and we need to impose change through the covenants in credit and lease agreements. So these are the criteria of metrics that we applied to our work. Now, on the difference between net zero and 1.5 degrees. What does net zero mean? Net zero refers to the CO2 emissions in the year 2050, and that these emissions may not exceed net zero, irrespective how to get there. That means theoretically there is no limit on the cumulative emissions on the way to 2050, as long as in 2050 we are close to zero. Which means you cannot calculate a budget, a permissible budget of emissions that we have at our disposal, quote unquote, to emit on our way to 2050. Net zero is just looking at 2050. The 1.5 degrees objective is part of the Paris Agreement, and it refers to the cumulative effect of all greenhouse gas emissions, not only CO2, any other greenhouse gas, including non-CO2, like contrails. And all these measures together until 2050 may not cause an overall warming in excess of additional 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. That allows a budget to be calculated, but you will be confronted with very large uncertainties when you try to do the math on calculating the warming effect of the aviation industry in its entirety, let alone for a particular airline. To give an example of the various uncertainties related when you try to calculate the warming effect of the aviation industry or a particular airline. This is from the IPCC report, which is the reference in sustainability. And these numbers here are taken one-to-one from their most recent report. They apply to the world, not just to aviation, but they show the difficulty very nice. Here you see the warming that is anticipated between 1.5, very demanding, up to 2 degrees, less demanding. And this is the probability, how much megatons or gigatons of CO2 are we allowed to emit as a world to have a 50% chance not to exceed 1.5 degrees. 50% is flipping a coin. We are bankers. We are financiers. You should not go to your credit committee and proposing a major investment with a probability of 50% to get your money back. You will get a call from someone very senior in your credit committee if you propose. So if we assume levels of risk that appear acceptable in the finance industry, we certainly have to move far to the right in terms of probabilities. Yet the vast majority of studies relate to the flipping coin probability of 50%, maybe 67%, but not above. Related to this high level of uncertainty, 50% probability, you have additional sources of uncertainty, like the variation coming from contrails or other sources of uncertainty, which combined tells us it is very difficult to calculate the warming effect, claiming it is a precise assessment for 1.5 or 1.6 or 1.7. And if you break that further down to airlines, you have to make additional assumptions how much of the global budget you allocate to airlines, to aviation. This is a particularly hard to obey industry, so you should allocate a slightly larger portion of the global budget to aviation. How much, what assumptions to do, etc., etc., etc. So you have the breakdown of the global budget. You allocate to aviation, you allocate to individual airline, you allocate to particular aircraft, and you end up in noise, effectively. So we try to find an easier way to achieve the objective of protecting Mother Earth, but in a more tangible way, more appropriate and meaningful for the financial industry. In the Paris Climate Agreement, it's explicitly said that the financial industry has to take over a significant part of the responsibility to implement the objectives set forth by the Paris Climate Agreements. That means if it's the financial industry has two objectives: protect your vital interest in decarbonizing the industry, because otherwise you harm your own business. And secondly, it means do it in a way that you give credits to promising companies, to promising projects that have a chance, that are credit worthy, not anything. How to do it? We looked at all the KPIs available in the various sustainability reports from airlines and condensed them all down to 3 essential KPIs. Our result of our studies was these 3 basic KPIs, these 3 essential KPIs are sufficient to portray a fair and balanced picture of the industry or particular airline. If you add a 4th KPI, you don't add much value. If you omit one of these 3, you cause harm to the conclusiveness of your numbers. Footprint, so how much CO2 does an airline emit in total? Intensity, because that's the only way to assess the contribution of a particular technology, aircraft, engine. And the 3rd one is decoupling. Decoupling is exactly what we have shown on this chart here, to measure how wide the gap is becoming between the trend of production volume and the trend of CO2. The wider the gap, the better. There are 2 stages in this dimension, as I will explain later on. But as long as CO2 is going up, and the gap is widening, we call it relative decoupling. As soon as CO2 is developing south, we have a negative development of CO2. We reduce our CO2 emissions, whilst RPK hopefully remains growing, then it's called absolute decoupling. And absolute decoupling is the only way to move the aviation industry towards the objective of the Paris Climate Accord. Aside from these three essential KPIs, we identified there's a lot of confusion. There's significant inconsistency among the various definitions. What is CO2? What is a CO2 molecule? Are we talking about CO2 or are we talking about CO2 equivalent? What is a flight? Is a flight, do you report a Lufthansa flight when it carries a Lufthansa flight number, considering wet leases? Or do we exclude wet leases and count wet leases as scope 3? Some airlines include it as scope 1, others put it into scope 3. Makes the numbers completely incomparable. I call it payload. What kind of measure do you take? Do you look at passenger emissions or cargo or both, belly cargo, etc.? What is the reference you look at? How to measure capacity? Today we measure RPK. We are in advanced negotiations with IATA and other organizations to upgrade to RTK as soon as possible, because that would allow us to directly compare passenger and cargo business. But again, crawl, walk, run, as long as the airlines predominantly report RPK and not RTK, we stick to RPK. Periodicity airline, if you look at the Lufthansa Group or IAG or other groups, they publish some KPIs at group level, but not at the level of the individual operating carriers, and vice versa. So you need to standardize quite a few of these definitions to be able to compute footprint, intensity, and particulate decoupling. We developed the following concept to make life easy. Again, it is all about crawl, walk, run. We have two objectives, as said. You have the objective of reducing CO2 emissions. So we have a coordinate system where there's a negative direction, the change of CO2 emissions from no change at the origin of the coordinate system to complete elimination of CO2, 100% decarbonization. The other direction is doubling your emissions. On the other axis, we measure RPK, production volume, because as bankers, we don't want to give a credit, or not that easily, to an airline that is shrinking. We want to give creditworthiness to airlines that are successful on the market, that grow. So giving both situations, both objectives, creditworthiness based on the ability to grow, but at the same time, strict emphasis on decarbonization, we have a very simple coordinate system. The worst case is an airline that is worsening its emission and shrinking. The best case is an airline that is growing and successfully reducing its emissions. We simply add a grid, overlay a grid on this coordinate system to make the worst case being upper left and the best case to the lower right. Then we add scores, and this is very easily done. It's a lookup table, effectively. If you look at the diagonal, that means the change of CO2 is in exact proportion, is tightly coupled with change of capacity. That means this airline is not progressing at all. Remember the two curves from Lufthansa and EasyJet? If the blue and the orange curve keep going the same way all the time, no progress. So this would be tightly coupled, 0 points. If an airline succeeds to reduce the CO2 emissions, or at least to reduce the growth of the CO2 emissions in relation to the growth of capacity, we give it a score of 1, because that's progress. It's relative decoupling because the CO2 is still increasing, but from Mother Earth's perspective, it's a progress in itself. We give a score of 2 for an airline that is rapidly growing and is reducing its CO2 emissions, absolute reduction. And we give a score of 3 to an airline that is rapidly growing and at the same time drastically reducing its CO2 emissions. There is absolutely nothing wrong with an airline that is successful in reducing its CO2 emissions to grow. Nothing wrong. To the contrary. So we have this diagonal with 0, and we have, the more we go to the right, we add a score, an increment of 1, and the more we go down, successful decarbonization, we again add a score of 1, giving a range from -3, very bad development in terms of additional emissions, and very bad development in terms of shrinkage. This would be a near market exit position. But we have scores allocated to each of these positions. Then we take these positions and say, okay, if you have a score of 1, this is easy to achieve. Most airlines today, and we have collected all the data from the airline reports from 2002 onwards. So we have a pretty good sample of airlines, at least those airlines that do report those numbers. Most airlines today are in the area of relative decoupling. They grow, luckily, but they slowly succeed to reduce the growth of the emissions, so relative decoupling. That's easy to achieve. To get a score of 3 would be much more demanding. No airline today is in this area, rapidly growing and almost complete decarbonization. And we have a middle position, let's say a score of 2. Then we sort these scores on a vertical axis. And this is what we call the milestones. We give a financial incentive to an airline as soon as the airline crosses a level of 1, a milestone 1, which is equivalent to an easy to achieve entry-level score. We don't demand, we don't require that the airline achieves that in a particular time. There's no need for that. As soon as you are there, like a marathon, as soon as you cross the 10-kilometer mark, you get a score. If you score, the sooner you reach more demanding milestones, the sooner you have access to financial incentives. It is not required you get to the level of 2 or 3 at a particular time. You better do early, because the earlier you get there, the earlier you get the financial incentive. So we do not depend on particular assumptions of forecasts of a pathway in the future. It is just the earlier you get there, the earlier you have access to financial covenants. This system does not require any modeling, any math, nothing of that kind, no assumptions on when SAF is available or anything like that. It's just a lookup table with a few scores. What we found out is that a simple matrix of 4 times 4, the granularity is insufficient. So we made a lot of simulations, and the simulations told us we have to use a 16 times 16 matrix to have sufficient granularity. You need this higher granularity to make sure if an airline is progressing, that you recognize that progress first early, and secondly in sufficiently small steps. Otherwise, if you don't if you can't tell an airline you haven't moved a notch up within 10 years, the airline will leave the concept. So you, to have sufficient transparency of granular progress, you need a matrix of 16 times 16, but the concept is the same. We have plotted in dark gray the diagonal, which is tightly coupled. The emissions of CO2 are tightly correlated and dependent on the growth of capacity or traffic. We have the area of light gray, which is relative decoupling. So we have achieved to slow down the CO2 emissions, still increasing emissions, moving away from Paris, but it's better than tight coupling. It's significantly better, but it's not yet where we want to be. But this is relative decoupling. The bluish area down here is absolute decoupling. The airline is succeeding in net reducing its emissions and hopefully being able to grow. There's one challenge here, that is what happens, say, in 2030 or 2035 at the latest, hopefully. When SAF becomes available, it no longer is the aircraft technology or the engine technology that is pushing us forward. It's SAF. And you can drop SAF in each type of aircraft, almost each type of aircraft. So it's the availability of SAF, independent of what kind of aircraft you're operating, assuming that you have a certificate for 50 or 100% of SAF for most of the aircraft that fly around today. That means from 2030 onwards, or shortly thereafter, when SAF is available, there is no excuse why not moving into the territory of absolute decoupling. That means for us, in the incentive system that we offer to the airlines in our proposed lending and lease contracts, in the scheme we develop, an airline can keep its scores that it has reached by 2030. They are frozen. But beyond 2030, if you progress within the territory of just mere relative decoupling, you cannot progress. You don't get any additional score once SAF is available in sufficient supply. The only way to improve your scoring is absolute decoupling. We tested the concept based on our database, backtesting, and took, again, these two airlines that I mentioned before. This is Lufthansa, this is EasyJet, normalized not to 2019, which we would propose, but in this case to the year 2008 to show the effect. And what we observe is, in this case, Lufthansa from 2008, there was a reference year, so no change. And then if you move up the time scale, you observe that 2013, 14, 15, they shifted to the right and then kept moving again. So slight decoupling, and this is most likely attributable to the introduction of NEO technology. Very interesting to observe the performance in the pandemic, 2020-21. So Lufthansa crashed down, but along the diagonal axis. It does not move anywhere in weird direction, because CO2 is capacity was grounded, was significantly reduced, and in proportion, the emissions went down as well. Of course, has to, but it was a movement along the diagonal axis. Since Lufthansa is very much depending on long-haul traffic, and long-haul traffic crosses national borders, and national borders were sanctioned in the pandemic, Lufthansa had a severe problem, of course, during the pandemic. Re-emerged, everything is fine again, but that explained the massive problem of any hub-and-spoke carrier that is operating long-haul. EasyJet had a similar pattern, again, relative decoupling, far away from absolute decoupling. And the impact of the pandemic was way less pronounced, because EasyJet is operating within the EU, yes, but only very few international cross-border flights to outside the EU. So the harm of the pandemic was less pronounced for the low-cost carrier. There is one takeaway message. Again, the milestone concept rewards the earliest possible achievement of the highest possible scores without any need of modeling. This way, it takes on a similar characteristics to a limited budget of allowable greenhouse gas emissions, because different from the, so to speak, unplugged net zero approach, which is agnostic to a budget, we give a reward. The earlier you get there, the more reward you get. So there is an impact of the time course in this concept. One step back, my mouse. This concept, the milestone concept, as you can see on this chart, particularly well, allows direct comparison of various business models. You can directly compare the decarbonization performance of a hub and spoke carrier like Lufthansa and a low-cost carrier like EasyJet or Spirit or Allegiant or Spring in China or whatever. Because we look at change and not at absolute figures like intensity. You cannot compare the intensity directly of a hub and spoke carrier, United or Cathay, and a low-cost carrier, Allegiant or EasyJet or Ryanair. You cannot. The figures are substantially different for good reason. Based on the milestone concept, a score of 7 is a score of 7, and it applies for either way, the low-cost carrier or the hub and spoke carrier. Again, in summary, what the advantages of the milestone concept are is, as I said, you can directly compare the business models. You don't have to make any assumptions, no modeling, nothing, no trajectory, no forecast. All it takes is a simple lookup table to check what kind of score applies to a particular situation when an airline can deliver figures, or your carbon calculator can provide the figures for change of RPK or RTK and CO2. What we are working on today is in the working streams as discussed, so no external consultants. You are wholeheartedly invited to join these working streams on template contracts for lending. So we have a team working on that, meeting each week at least once to develop a standard template for covenants based on the milestone concept. So we want to go one step further, not just standardize and ease life for reporting, but for financial covenants. We want to impose change through financial covenants and incentives in their respective contracts. We're working on the wording, and on the process of broad consulting with a significant variety of airlines collecting feedback. So far, very, very positive because the concept is so simple. We also discussed with the EU Commission, with other organizations, World Economic Forum, IATA, of course, universal positive feedback. Leasing is a different story. Leasing is more complex because you not only have the operator as a dimension, you have the asset as a dimension as well, which makes life a little bit more complex to find a proper concept. We are almost done, but I cannot claim that we are done yet. But the objective, of course, is the same. We need standard templates. And in the science team, we challenge the idea of 1.5 degrees Celsius, not as a concept, of course not, because that's the ultimate objective to limit the global warming. But for financiers of aviation, the concept of net zero is much more tangible, much more hands-on, and much better to be used for contractual purposes. And anything else, if you add uncertainties, elements of uncertainty, as you would have to do with warming criteria in credit contracts, the contract can easily be attacked later on legal grounds. So that's why we prefer the concept of net zero. Thank you very much for your attention and looking forward for your applications to become a member in Impact.
Well, thank you very much there, Philip. Very interesting. And I see the questions have started to come in quick and thick. Let's kick off immediately with the first one. Bit of an interesting one here. Based on your presentation, gap between RPK and CO2 emissions is inherently good. So yeah, should we ban all premium classes, and put everybody in a 28-inch pitch? That would widen the gap quite a bit, and then isn't the world worth a little discomfort? And will you personally give up? We shouldn't have asked personal questions here, but will you give up premium class travel to help out
question?
Brilliant
question.
And one point that this person is making, that Ryanair and EasyJet will always win compared to a Lufthansa or a Air France or an Emirates for that matter. So interesting. I mean, I think they're two slightly different questions. But yes, please.
I have a personal preference, but the discussion is ongoing. Some of our members prefer RPK because they view RPK as a measure of overcapacity. The higher the seat load factor, the better the utilization of the asset. The other camp, including me, favors certainly RTK or ATK. I prefer ATK, but I don't know if there will be consensus on that. But the advantage of ATK is it is the weight of the aircraft that is driving emissions. And if you put a lot of passengers into a small aircraft, you increase the weight, you increase the emissions. You utilize the aircraft better. But even an empty plane, no passengers, no cargo aboard, emits a lot of CO2. And this is better captured by the weight of the aircraft rather than the seat load factor. And the seat load factor is a very shy animal. I'm an airline strategist. It's easy to drive seat load factors up and down by selling seats below value. So I'm not a great believer in seat load factor as a performance indicator. So,
just sorry on it's
yeah.
I think the point here is similar. Even if a more premium heavy aircraft will it will still be the load factor, the RPK will be lower than, and similarly the RTK will be or ATK for that matter. Yeah.
But the rationale is the same.
Yes.
Strictly speaking, we must move away from the utilization of the aircraft. I mean the seat load factor, whatever the configuration is, towards the weight of the aircraft. Earlier or later, we have to move that way.
And so, just on the point of a low-cost carrier versus a hub and spoke carrier, the low-cost carrier will always have look better on paper, basically.
The low-cost carriers look better.
Yeah.
Because of intensity.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, if you look at intensity isolated, of course, that's why we need decoupling to explain the different message from CO2 footprint and intensity. Ryanair is extremely successful in intensity scoring, but they emit more and more CO2 each year, a lot. So how to explain the obvious performance in terms of intensity and the obvious moving away from the Paris climate objectives by emitting more and more CO2. The measure you need to explain the gap is decoupling. By the way, many of our members view decoupling as essential to explain to the public, no, we are not yet there where we want to be, but we are progressing. And you cannot do that based on either CO2 absolute, nor on intensity. It's not sufficiently credible, but decoupling is a very, very powerful means to demonstrate clearly we are progressing.
Thanks for that. Quite a few questions, so we're trying to get all of them. So, you reduce CO2 emissions by buying new fuel-efficient airplanes, but reducing these airplanes has an environmental cost, and throwing away airplanes before the normal economic end of life is also not the right thing to do for the government, for the environment and emissions. And this is the case basically when you only look at RPK to CO2. This is what happens. So
yes.
Are you advocating an acceleration phase out of the old generation aircraft prior to 25 years, and who will pay for the premature write-off of asset value? Very direct question there.
As you can imagine, many controversial discussions among the members. I can explain my personal view. I don't think that a phase out of an accelerated phase out of mid-aged aircraft is. The impact is marginal, probably, because an aircraft we introduced today, economic life is 25 years. If nothing happens, the same aircraft, MAX, NEOs, will fly 2050. So we have a global issue. We have modern and super modern aircraft, and we have old and very old aircraft. From the Mother Earth's perspective, to switch a third world airline to move from a very old aircraft to an old aircraft has probably a more significant effect on total emissions than moving a modern airline from modern aircraft to super modern aircraft. So we need to think twice what the real impact is about. Second point, this only works until 2030, 2033, whatever, when SAF is available. By then, the new technologies, the COs, will have no longer any significant differentiating effect. It will be SAF that will differentiate, the availability of SAF. And this is what we have to fight for, that there will be sufficient supply of SAF. The engine technology that will move the needle a little bit within the territory of relative decoupling for the next 10 years, but not beyond. So the leverage in terms of decarbonization of SAF is significantly longer than engine technology. However, today, the only thing we can do is more advanced aircraft technology. But for the next 10 years.
I mean, pick up on SAF, which I agree is the most important, progress that we will make on this one. How are you? And you picked up on right points in your metrics. I mean, how the cost of it and the price elasticity, compared to it's going to be more expensive, that's for sure. And how much airlines will be able to pick up. How will the EU taxonomy and other affect SAF production? I think also key assumptions in whatever matrix you come up with. But I mean, how will, I mean, maybe a more basic question is how would you measure the CO2 impact of SAF in your graphs? I mean, when you apply SAF, does it immediately become a 1 or a 2, or how does it actually work? If you don't mind me asking.
Again, took us quite some time to come up with the following conclusion, which is the simplest model of all, as usual. The airlines will report life cycle corrected CO2. If you purchase SAF in itself emits CO2, but SAF has the advantage of being cycled. Whatever raw material you take, if it's biomass or PTL or whatever, it's dropped. So the quality of SAF comes with a certificate. What is the life cycle benefit of this particular type of SAF? It's a very complex stuff to calculate. But the airlines, when they purchase the SAF, they know. And irrespective if you take the mass balance approach from the EU Commission or the book and claim approach, the airline will do the calculation. What is the CO2 emissions corrected by the fact that we use SAF? This is what they will report to protect their own interest.
Of course.
So this figure is what we want. This figure is what we will take, the SAF, the life cycle corrected emissions of SAF.
No, it's absolutely. It's going to be a lot of reporting. As I said, the data is key, and how much airlines will have to report will really be driving
if
this.
If you take the various blends of SAF that you could intake at a particular airport, you die in a nirvana of complexity, and no way to follow. Let the airlines do it. Let the airlines report based on certified numbers, of course, and certified appraisers need to do it. But it's still one number, CO2 emissions, but it's not just based on fossil emissions, it's life cycle corrected. Whatever SAF you take, if it's a biomass or if it's a PTL, tell me what the net effect is about. By the way, what we also propose is not only SAF, but we will be more than happy to offset against carbon capture effects as well. not the reforestation stuff, but carbon capture is way too important as a means to eliminate carbon emissions from the atmosphere to be ignored. So any emission effect based on SAF, life cycle corrected, or carbon capture, happy.
But so yeah, from a greenwashing perspective, you're not including reforestation and other current, climate compensation scheme that airlines are offering to
our members tell us it's not just us. It's that the compliance rules of the financial institutions. Many of them tell us we are not allowed to acknowledge those measures.
Very good. Very good. No, it's absolutely a good point. Next question. What if I have the world's most inefficient airline today? It's easy to get better going forward. If I have a very efficient airline today, my path forward on your grid is very difficult. Doesn't your system punish those airlines who are already very efficient, new planes, like EasyJet, etc., and reward those who have been the most inefficient in the recent past, old airplanes, less dense layouts, etc.?
Yes. We ran into those discussions when we interviewed airlines early on. There have been some airlines that said exactly what you said. We have invested since 10 years in the most state-of-the-art fleet. Don't punish us. The answer is, it's not simple, but it's clear. As a reference year, as a default, we take progress compared to 2019 as a base year. If here comes an airline and it says for the last 10 years, we have heavily invested, so why not use the year 29 or 28 or 2012 or 2016 as a reference year? Nothing wrong. The methodology fully applies and the results are fully comparable. If an airline says we are much more advanced, fine. So let's discuss what base year applies to your past investment behavior. Nothing wrong.
Okay. So the base here is not set in stone.
It's a proposal to make life easy for all parties. But if there's a good reason that the airline wishes to deviate from 2019 as a base year, most airlines will prefer 2019 because it's a peak year. But if there is a desire to move to another year, nothing wrong. It's just a bit more calculation in an Excel sheet to calculate the figures. That's it.
Derek Hughes has two questions. How could new airlines be evaluated according to the evaluation system? I think we did, Philip did go through that, but were airlines that used to have a very old fleet have an advantage over those that have a new fleet? I think we did touch upon, but if you want to add anything else, Philip, on this one?
I think that's the rationale I described.
Yeah. Doug Kelly has this question. Can the airline industry achieve the goal of net carbon zero by 2050 if, number one, traffic grows by 3.5% per annum, number two, Airbus and Boeing introduced new narrow-body aircraft in 2035 with 20% fuel burn improvement, and three, aircraft use 100% SAF by 2035? So I think he's giving you options here.
There were a little bit too many assumptions to do the math in my head.
It's not. I think it's not assumptions. I think it's.
The question is I think we could go very far, but you cannot achieve, let's say, net zero without SAF, and particularly if the airline industry keeps growing, and this is what we strongly favor to keep growing. But the rate of growth will determine what is feasible to be achieved and what is not feasible. One word on degrowth. There's a lot of scientific literature strongly suggesting degrowth, significant degrowth, not just a little bit. Let's assume SAF will be available by 2035. Sufficient SAF. From that moment onwards, as I said, there is no reason why not allow an airline to grow, even strongly. If an airline is successful in decarbonizing, keep growing. That means, if true, that any degrowth scenario only makes sense within the next 10 years or so. Significantly, drastically shrinking this industry within the next 10 years or so will not allow the industry to grow again thereafter. And the social devastations we will observe from a drastic degrowth or shrinkage of this industry within 10 years will probably outweigh the catastrophic effects of climate warming. I don't want to see either.
I think everyone here in the audience would share that. Yeah, Doug is clarifying. It is he is assuming all three conditions together. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what you answered them on. We had one question in the chat. How about Lufthansa 2021 point, very low on the graph, very similar RPK versus previous year, but much lower CO2. How can it be explained? Very specific point on the graph that you showed.
It's just a long-haul effect that we have seen that pattern for any airline that has a high share of long-haul operations, because you have to ground your long-haul fleet. And if you ground your long-haul fleet, you have no connections between long-haul and short-haul. You have no feeder, no defeeder. That means the integrated dependence of long-haul and short-haul is broken. And that airline has a severe problem, much more than a point-to-point carrier in that situation. We have seen it for any major airline, except in the US, because the US domestic market is very large, but in Europe for sure.
Last question we have, I think we'll stop after this, is Heathrow has frozen the expansion of additional runway and Schiphol reducing the number of flights. So the growth that you were alluding to cope with the decarbonization. Is this going to be the main trend for the most impactful CO2 reduction? We hope not. I think the answer to that is, but yes, I mean, you just made that point, I think.
I'm a strategist, but I have no crystal ball. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the right way to constrain growth by just not providing any infrastructure to grow. But why not grow if and only if we are successful in decarbonizing the industry? If we don't build the infrastructure today, there is no option to grow once we have decarbonized the industry.
So maybe one thing to conclude here. I mean, you are optimistic that the industry can, using SAF and carbon capture, keep growing while achieving net zero by 2050.
I think it's maybe I'm an optimist, but I think we have to work into that direction for sure.
I would totally support that and second that. So thank you, Philipp, so much for this very interesting the discussion, and very as you know, topic is very relevant to many discussions our industry peers are having with banks and airlines, and I think impact is definitely our role to play in this. So thanks again for your time, and for the audience, thank you for your very interesting questions and your attendance. And this podcast will be available online in the next few days for people that can watch it. And we have another learning lab, I think, very soon on another topic as interesting. So please stay tuned, and thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. If you have any questions, send me a mail and I'll do my best to answer. All the best.
All right. Bye-bye.